Thank you very much. Kia ora. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you, Matt and the team and all of you for the invitation. My name is Alistair McCready, and I study and I draw and I use typefaces. This little symbol here is called a pilcrow. Many of you might think of it as the paragraph symbol. You know, when you're writing your essays and you've got your hidden characters on and this little guy will pop up. Well, once upon a time, these used to be written in between lines of text by scribes to delineate that pause we now know as the paragraph. Over time, it made its way towards the margins before just being left out altogether, and this is actually where the indent in a paragraph first came from. But it also helps to describe a little of the work I do. My work is there, but it's kind of not. In fact, I often describe to people that if I do my job correctly, no one actually knows I exist. I run a typographic design studio called Monolith, and we feel strongly that the best ideas are really only measured by an ability to execute them with care and with craft. So we partner with design studios and organisations, companies, and just individuals to take those ideas and we pressure test them to make sure they're the best versions of themselves. And often this could be anything, but most of the time it takes the form of letters. No two letters are the same. The typographic landscape is vast and it's varied. And letters help to form the fabric of the world we live in day to day. And now a lot of designers love type, but it's a very daunting discipline to understand and to decode. Some typefaces are somewhat eccentric. Some are balanced and reserved. Some are meant to be used really, really big. Some really small. Some have a large amount of contrast between thick and thin strokes, while others are comparatively monolinear. But as I said, I don't just draw fonts for myself, I also draw them for companies. That's primarily what we do at this stage. We've created fonts for reward schemes, logistics companies, film franchises and film studios, rugby teams, football, what am I talking about, sorry. God. Football bodies and football tournaments. And this work has appeared on trucks, it's appeared on labels, on bottles, and it's appeared cast into the glass of bottles. Shown up on building awnings and building facades, and my favourite of all, it's come into the pages of books. I just want to acknowledge a studio I worked at for a number of years called In-House. This work, as well as the work for New Zealand Post and Steinlager, was done while I was a member of their team. And I often get called a typographer, which is true, but so are all of you. In fact, if you've ever written a text or sent an email, you might argue that you're a typographer. You see, a type designer draws fonts, and a typographer uses them. And I know it's kind of clutching at straws a bit here, but it's a bit like calling someone who makes violins a violinist. Like, you're obviously going to know how to play the thing, otherwise you'd be pretty useless at what you do. But there's a different way of approaching it, different thinking involved. And I'm only saying this now not to sound pretentious, it's just to really help unpack a bit of what I want to talk about today, which is a bit about what I do, but it's also about why I do it and my approach to it. Once I've done that a little bit, I'll talk about some projects I've done. One for Toblerone, and another was a large suite of fonts we made for an organisation called Stuff. And if you haven't worked out by now by my beautiful accent, I'm not from here. I'm from across the ditch, as we call it, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I grew up on the eastern side of the country in an area called Hawke's Bay, and like a lot of parts of New Zealand, this was once completely destroyed by an earthquake. This is Napier, the city of Napier, in 1931. It was an awful event, still New Zealand's worst ever natural disaster, or one-off. Subsequently, the city was rebuilt in a very Art Deco style, and when you go there, you can feel this. It's like a time capsule. And the city really identifies so strongly with us, even today. They have the Art Deco Festival every year. It's a big deal. I couldn't care less about this growing up. I just wanted to play guitar. All I ever wanted to do was play music. Design wasn't something on my radar until one day I walked into a print shop and I was offered a job. I was just getting some shirts done for the band, and he said, "Do you want to print them yourself?" And this set me on a path towards design. Several years later, I left and I went to university, studied graphic design, and at this point I started to draw letters. And a lot of people come to type design by way of a shared love of design and technology. But this wasn't the case for me. I loved history and I loved design, and drawing fonts seemed to be the perfect way to bring those two things together. In fact, I think I was trying to run away from technology. I was scared of learning how to code, but it kind of caught up with me. So it turns out making fonts and software kind of involves a bit of code. This object here is called a wakahuia. They're an indigenous, essentially a treasure box, carved by Māori, really intricately beautiful object to house taonga, to house treasure. And for me, it captured what type design could be, these beautifully carved forms that could carry meaning, they could embody and carry that taonga with them. And letters are signifiers. These two photos are by an American photographer called Jeff Gusky. And the image on the left is by, it's in a town called Arras in France, and a series of tunnels that were dug by the New Zealand division in the First World War. And you can go there still today. I'm actually going myself in a few months' time. And those letters, there's ferns, there's kiwis, there's portraits of soldiers carved on these walls. And above ground, it's actually not a whole lot different. These are craters left by artillery shells. Both these scars on the landscape, they recall the same memory, the same event. And in New Zealand, we have similar things. We had a series of conflicts called the New Zealand Wars in the middle of the 19th century, I think. I always get those ones confused. But essentially, there was a series of conflicts between the Crown and our indigenous people, between Māori. And it was an awful series of events. Only now, nearly 200 years on, are we starting to teach people about them and what actually went on. It's been a big cause of a lot of embarrassment for our country. But left behind from this conflict are various what are called redoubts or power sites, essentially fortifications that we use to fight these battles. And the buildings have long gone, but the scars on the landscape are still there. And you can jump on Google Earth and you can look down and you can see them, they're little glyphs in the landscape. And in the same way we carve the land, we also carve the letter. And type, that typographic landscape I mentioned, is vast and it's varied, and it becomes a way of navigating the world around us. We're map making. And so letters have become my way of seeing the world and understanding the world. I lived and worked in London for a number of years, and while I was there, I realised now I was in a really, really heavy state of anxiety. It's quite an intense place to live, especially when you're not earning much money. I was working as a graphic designer during the day, and I was really, really struggling where I was currently at, and I'd spend my lunch breaks sitting in coffee shops just sketching from my camera reel, which was just full of fonts. And if you're hearing all this and you're thinking, well, dude, just chill out, they're just letters. And I completely respect that. In fact, I live with that day to day. Every day after a long, hard day of drawing fonts, I'll go home and my lovely wife, who's here with me today, will ask me, what have you been working on? And I'll sit down and I'll show her. And I'm pretty sure she thinks I'm a total muppet. So a few years back, I wrote and I designed a book. And this book centered on the links between typeface design and the monumental. Specifically, I was really interested in this idea that I could design a font in memory of something or someone, and then by using it, they would go on to live forever. To help narrow that gaze, I looked at Anzac memorials across New Zealand and Australia, something that's very important to both countries. That trauma of war affected us so badly despite being so far away geographically. When you see these things together, you actually realise how different they are. You see, when you grow up around them, you're just, it's another monument, nothing big. But they vary, some are large in their civic centres, and some line the edges of parks, and some just seemingly appear out of nowhere. This is a bridge that recalls the names of sons who never came home to take over their families' farms. And so now that community just doesn't exist anymore. But I wasn't just looking at the monuments, I was looking at the letters on them. And a lot of them are carved, they're specific to place, they're not machined, they're just done by hand. And as a way of interacting more with these, I would do a lot of stone rubbings. To me, it was like recording a conversation with an inanimate form. And when you treat them in a certain way, they take on all sorts of detail. They're really quite ghostly and ethereal. And beyond that, I was drawing fonts. This was my way of teaching myself how to draw. I would take these inanimate shapes and I would try and reimagine them into full alphabets. And all of this ended up in a book. Went around the world, it was great, and I was known for a while as the monument guy, which sounds cool. It was cool for a little while, I guess, but it's actually something I've had to work really hard to try and shake off. You see, the reason for this is on the other side of all this ideas of monumentality and imbuing meaning into fonts is this equal notion that good type design and good typography is about being reductive and being reserved. This is a really important lady called Beatrice Ward, who in 1930, she gave a speech-tuned essay called The Crystal Goblet. And in it, she likens good typography, the setting of type, the use of type, to a crystal glass, and that our focus should not be on the glass, it should be on the liquid within. So our role as designers was to clarify and hero that content, that liquid. Type is there to be looked through, not upon. And this is really forward-thinking for that time. If you think about the type, there's fonts everywhere on a page. It was carnage, it was chaos. And Ward comes along and goes, no, let's just chill out, And the problem I have with this, I think about this probably more than most. But I got no issue with it. What I'm getting at here is that designers now, nearly 100 years later, still cling onto this like it's the absolute gospel. Neutrality and clarity can run the risk of being very mechanical and plain. And designers will love to slap a sans on something and call it good design. We didn't know what to do, so we'll just call it neutral. And everyone's like, oh yeah, it's so clean, I love it. But what does this look like in 2023? This is a very inauthentic way to work. I think authenticity is quite important these days. And it's easy in design to live at two ends of a spectrum, good or bad, black or white, right or wrong, sans or serif, And in doing that, you miss out all this good stuff in the middle by asking those questions. Is this good design? You should be asking yourself, is it appropriate design? Is this right for the content? So if you can imagine this line going from one side of the room to the other, up here we got the highly decorative, the ornate, the display types of the world, and then down the other end we've got the neutral style, which is a lot more reductive, a lot more reserved, your Helveticas, that kind of thing. Everything in between is gesture to be dialed up or dialed down. And I can tell you most of the time what I do is just helping people unpack where on this line they want their work to sit. That town of Napier I mentioned, where I'm from, a while back, because they identify so strongly with this Art Deco story, they decided they want to redo their signage in a very Art Deco style. And this is what they came up with. But can you imagine hurtling down the road and trying to find out where you're going, trying to read that? They dialed the gesture just way too up, Now, on the other end of that spectrum might have been a typeface like Futura, which is very mechanical in its origin, but it's got a lot of qualities that make it very Art Deco as well. So what does this look like in my own work? Well, as I said, I made a typeface for Toblerone. This was asked by a studio in London called Bulletproof, really amazing branding and packaging design studio. And the typeface recalls the logo. Basically, it exists in 3 layers that layer together to complete that Toblerone, that iconic look. You know the one I'm talking about. And it's been around for over 100 years now. And this is a really common place to start with making a font, right? Taking the static thing and saying, finish it off, finish the alphabet, something I've done a lot of, so that's cool. But with a word mark, things are static, they're set. You can really focus on that interplay between letters. But when you're making a typeface, you've got infinite combinations of letters working together. You have to think of it as a system. So I couldn't just pluck out, oh yes, sweet, got a B, got an L, happy days. On we go. I had to reinterpret it as a system and understand where it was going to sit. Looking at the archive, Toblerone archive, kind of just gave me mild anxiety. It was just crazy. It was really unhelpful. There's just so much going on. In fact, all that really came from it was they had a typeface done in the past by a wonderful British designer called Carol Kemp, but as with any new branding project, it was time to evolve. And we realised that the only really commonplace throughout all this history was that their logo hadn't really shifted much at all. Above is some of the earliest packaging I could find from 1908, and below is the new version of their logo that they did in 2021. So what we did, instead of thinking about where's this origin point we can draw on, we thought about the thinking and the influences of the time, which was Art Nouveau, to help complete this typeface. Now, Art Nouveau, you probably think perhaps the architecture of Gaudi, or the poster art of Alphonse Mucha, who himself dabbled in a bit of typeface design. If you're fortunate enough to go to Paris, you might think of the entrances to the metro. It's iconic Art Nouveau style designed by Hector Guimard in 1901. This typeface is what you'd expect from an Art Nouveau font, right? It's pretty gestural, it's pretty over the top, pretty loose. On the other side of that, we have Ariel by Georges Ariel, again from the same year, 1901. And you're probably wondering what the hell this has got to do with chocolate. Well, if you can recall the spectrum idea I had from before, above the new logo, below are the same letters from our typeface. Now, it was just about finding the right balance of that Art Nouveau expression while maintaining a certain amount of semblance of unity, of systematic approach to drawing fonts. So you still got the idea across, but you could use it, you could communicate with it. One of our big moves we made, was to take the classic Toblerone O and all this gesture, all this stress on the right-hand side, we shifted it to the left. But in doing so, we laid a better foundation for some of those open aperture characters like a C or a G. So you can imagine if that counterform was tucked up into the shoulder like that, it would have been quite over the top, pretty hardcore. So, it's all about being hardcore. And so really all this was just an exercise of simplification. It was only really possible once we got our head into that zeitgeist, that Art Nouveau style. And the numbers are always really fun to draw, these were especially. And Toblerone, right? Okay, that's a very display font. I get where you're coming from, man. Just, but what else you got? Okay, well, moving on. Same year, in 2021, we were asked by this time a New Zealand studio called Designworks to create a suite of fonts this time for an organisation called Stuff. It's one of New Zealand's oldest and largest media entities, and this was really about unification. See, their current offering had been chopped and changed over the years. Fonts didn't really work well together, and there was a lot of characters missing. So if you're typing away, telling the news in New Zealand, you should probably speak the language, but these didn't have a lot of the important accented characters for languages like Te Reo Māori. And there was also an opportunity there to imbue some of that meaning into the letters from the brand strategy, the new direction they were taking. When you design a bespoke type of this scale, a really good place to start is the common skeleton, which is essentially, if you can imagine, a thin line determining the overall shape of a letter form. You just add weight accordingly. It's a really good way to form a common design language while, across different genres and things have their own tone of voice. So that 5 type families altogether, they all have their own sense of identity, but they have a shared language where it counts. To date, it's the largest piece of work we've ever undertaken. There's 62 fonts in total. If you're wondering what the difference between a typeface and a font is, a typeface is the design, and a font is the way that design shows up. So a good way I've heard of it being described is like a typeface is like an album, and the font is the songs on the album. So in this case, we wrote and we recorded 5 albums. But we sort of played the same songs in different genres of music, so it sort of helped. Some numbers, 62 individual fonts, which means that many individual letters. And we did it within 7 months, which I don't recommend. Should usually take a bit longer. On top of this, my wife and I had just become parents, and we were in a lockdown. So sitting at the kitchen table with a newborn strapped to my chest, it was hectic. I don't recommend it. Back to this idea of imbuing meaning, okay? So this is a guy named Joseph Churchwood, and Joseph was a very prolific type designer of his time. He operated between Wellington, New Zealand, and his home country of Samoa. And sadly, Joseph passed away in 2013, but thankfully not before being recognised for some really important work he did. Specific to this project, Joseph had created various mastheads for the company in its forms over the years, and so Stuff and Designworks wanted to pay a homage to Joseph and his peculiar way of working. Joseph was known for working by hand. He didn't do a lot with a computer, and as such, he made his own drawing tools, and he left them behind. They're really amazing to think about how he created these systems with these. It's quite primal. Subsequently, a lot of his work doesn't exist in the digital realm. It's left to the archives, and so we were trawling through these and looking for ideas. We weren't reviving fonts. This was about finding a certain sense of Josephness in the work, looking for little moments where we could dial it up or dial it down accordingly. We'd run into trouble and think, okay, well, what would Joseph do? It was a really interesting way to work. I'd never done it before. And throughout this process, we were uncovering some gold, the stuff that was just perhaps too chaotic to have as the mainstream thing, but we wanted to leave it in there anyway, so we created what's called a stylistic set in a typeface, so you can turn it off or on, and it essentially just takes certain characters and dials that gesture up or down accordingly. And a lot of people think, oh, no one uses that stuff, and you're probably right, it doesn't need to be used all the time, but this is where bespoke type can get really interesting because it's storytelling. It doesn't matter if it's used or not, it's there. And it does get used, by the way. As well as all of that, there's, of course, this element of needing to make sure this thing's going to work. It's going to be utility at its core. As well as the display serif type, we drew what's called stuffed text, which is essentially the same origin point, but more made foolproof for like a phone screen or a newspaper. The newsprint's really, really harsh on typefaces. Those high-speed presses really smash them, so stuffed display over here on the left sort of melts away as it gets smaller, whereas stuffed text on the right, it holds up. So back to this spectrum, this design, this piece of work, it needed to live in multiple places. It needed to express personality and needed to embody a sense of story and lineage, but it also needed to be highly functional where it counted. It needed to be read. I have a little video that Designworks made to give you an overview of the whole brand as it works, and where the role the typefaces play in that. Big mihi to Designworks for all their efforts there. Look, now, I know you're all getting really hangry, so I won't hold on to you. I'll round it off. This is an aphorism called the law of the instrument, and it has absolutely nothing to do with typeface design. But it is a cognitive bias that involves an over-reliance on a familiar tool. Now, often typefaces get called tools, something you can put in the hands of a designer to make things with. And that sentiment is kind of there, but typefaces they're not tools, okay? A computer is a tool, or a hammer is a tool. The typeface is the outcome of those tools. It's a product, it's material. You know when you're watching a movie and a song will come on that is so beautifully perfect for that moment, and you think to yourself, oh, it's so genius, I never would have thought of that, but at the same time it just seems so obvious. Well, typefaces, when they're used well, can operate in the exact same way. In the same way an architect will select materials for a building, or a chef will choose ingredients, or a director will choose songs, materials are there to enhance and tell a story. They're there to enhance the message. And it's for this reason I make new typefaces, not because the human language is a problem solved, okay? It's always evolving, it's always changing. It's a living and breathing thing. And there are always new stories to tell.